Okay, so there were 30 people listed for the seminar. Maybe some more of them show up later. I think we were competing at this moment with this national seminar on inequality with Branko Milanovic and others. But we are happy to have you here. This is a joint seminar between NUPI and the National Institute for Consumer Research. It's presenting results from 2 India-related research projects at NUPI. Let's see if this works. So I'm Arne Melchior, heading the Center for International Economics and Trade at NUPI. This autumn we'll have a seminar on the trade war. We'll get back to more information about that. Today we present some results on research related to India. NUPI has stepped up research on Asia during the last decade, especially on China is being increased now. For India, we've been working on India for about 10 years. Initially, there was funding from the Norwegian embassy in Delhi, which stimulated research. Later, more funding from the Research Council of Norway. Then we had some projects that were focusing on India as such. Later, we also have research on India embedded in broader projects in other programs, because India is such a large and increasingly important part of the world economy and the world. So today we present results from 2 different projects. One is called FoodSec, which was funded under the INDNOR program of the Research Council of Norway during 2013 to 16, coordinated by the Consumer Research Institute, but with NUPI as a main partner, but also with partners in India, including some cooperation with ISEC. Arne Dulsrud, who will be a speaker later, was the project manager, and he will say a bit more general about this project. There is also this other project called Traders in the Food Value Chain, which is about agriculture, fisheries based trade and the role of middlemen, the value chains in these sectors, where we have a kind of development related component on the fisheries sector in India. So Meenakshi Rajiv, welcome to Norway. She could not attend our last workshop in that project, so we, for practical reasons, so she could come here now to present some of her ongoing work, and we have a chance to present and discuss it. So, so Meenakshi Rajiv will present her work from the Traders in the Food Value Chain project on value chains in India's fisheries sector. Later then we will have work on the food price differences across Indian states that I made myself. Food Consumption and Poverty by Arne Dulsrud and Uni Kjernes, and about droughts, household food consumption and nutritional intake by Fenella Carpena, earlier formerly at NUPI, now also at Oslo Met in Oslo. So we'll have a short lunch break after the first 2 presentations. We'll have direct questions to each speaker, and then later we have a joint question-answer session towards the end of the seminar. And the seminar is streamed live at NUPI's YouTube channel. So if you want to to check what we actually said, it will be available there. So so this is not all the work that was undertaken in, for example, in the FoodSec project. Another NUPI contribution was made by Carl Rich, who moved to New Zealand and then Vietnam. That's why he's not here to present his contribution, but his work on the value chains for potatoes in Bihar, model analysis of policy options and sustainability, that is available as a NUPI working paper. So the speakers will also inform you about publications related to each theme. So with these words, I will introduce and welcome Meenakshi Rajiv. ISEC, the Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore, India, has been a research partner of NUPI for almost a decade now. We have been involved in different projects. Bangalore is a thriving city, important in many areas, agriculture, ICT, etc. So Meenakshi has been in contact with NUPI for a decade now. So we're pleased to have her here talking about the fisheries sector of India and its value chains. So you have the floor. So Meenakshi is a professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Policy of ISEC, the Reserve Bank of India chair, and she's focused on development economics, game theoretic modeling, banking and credit, and other issues. She has also been a visiting fellow at several international universities. Please, Meenakshi.
Yeah, very good morning, and thanks very much to Arne because this project on traders in food value chain actually mostly have the European partner, but Arne thought that we should have some kind of developing country perspective, and there I came in because of Arne. Thank you very much for this. And this is also work in progress in this project, so not the final work. Now, fisheries sector is actually why I have taken this particular sector is that it's an important sector. It has, India has a long coastline of above 8,000 kilometers and 1,500 fish landing centers, 3,500 fishing villages, etc. And fish is an important product which gives protein to the diet of the people, mostly domestically consumed. But because India's population is so high, per capita consumption still is quite low, it also provides important employment to the fishing community. So also, of late, if we look at the international trade, this sector is increasingly becoming important for India and becoming a very leader in the fisheries exports, especially shrimp exported to USA is our main trading partner in this regard. Also, we export to EU. And with Norway, India has a very long-standing relation in the fisheries sector, from teaching us fisheries technology several decades back till now. And therefore, and other segments of the agriculture, especially the food crops, are studied by many. But this fisheries sector is not so much focused. So I thought that I would focus on this particular segment. But the problem is that there is not enough data from the secondary sources to do this study. And therefore, I had to do survey myself for this project with the help of one of my investigator. And therefore, the research mainly is I couldn't collect so much data. So research is primarily, in a sense, qualitative in nature, not so much of econometrics and quantitative. The coming straight to the methodology, we have selected Kerala as the state which is the highest fish producing state in India. And then we selected two districts from Kerala, and it's a kind of multi-stage sampling structure. In these two districts, we have selected randomly one of the talukas, which is a sub-district level unit from each district, and the fishing villages, some of the fishing villages are randomly selected. And then we went to the fishermen's union, fishermen's cooperatives, etc., and got some listing of the fishermen. It's very difficult to get the sampling frame in these cases, but somehow we tried to have a kind of and selected fishermen for our study. In addition, we have selected other entities in the supply chain, such as boat owner, auctioneer, merchants, etc. And then we had basically a questionnaire which is enumerated subsequently. Now, what I observe, the first main thing that is observed during our survey is certain important characteristic of the supply chain. Number one is that supply chain is very lengthy. So there are many intermediaries in the supply chain, which is a kind of a common developing country kind of perspective. Second thing is the informality. Many of these supply chain entities are informal in nature, that they are not registered anywhere, they may or may not pay taxes, and they are all this informal kind of network work. So informality is the second important characteristic. And third important characteristic is the market imperfection, which I will speak a little more subsequently. But the markets that work between different agents of the supply chain is not competitive. There is asymmetric information, there is collusion, and hence there is market imperfection in this segment. Now, if we go historically in our study area, and there are this fishermen community which used to go to the sea, especially to the near sea area, and then they used to have catch fish, and then they come and they themselves, many a time their wives and other members used to sell this fish. So they have a kind of boat which are not so mechanized, and they can go to the near sea. With the increase in population in the country, and after liberalization and increasing growth in the country, there is enough now increase in income, and demand for fish has increased. Whereas the supply in this near shore area has declined considerably because of overfishing, and there is a mismatch between demand and supply. And then came a new technology, that the more mechanized boats and trawlers and things like that. And these fishermen's income being very small had low saving, number one. And number two, the formal financial institution who could have given credit to them also did not operate so efficiently. Primarily, one is the lack of financial literacy among the fishermen, and secondly, lack of wealth and lack of collateral. So that did not. So there arose then a new class which is called the boat owners. Now the boat owners are the people with capital who purchased this high investment, made this high investment, and became an important player in this supply chain. So this new class arose, which is the boat owner. The fishermen who were the entrepreneur to begin with now have become laborer in the hands of the boat owner, because they saw that the near fish area fish production is very less. If they go to deep sea, they can get more fish, but to go to deep sea, they have to work for the boat owner. So they became now the laborer, and this transformation took place. There are different kinds of boats, non-motorized crafts which are of low value, which are used by fishermen. When there is motorized boats and mechanized like trawlers, purse seiners, etc. All these I have discussed in detail in my report. I can pass it on. Now, boat owner employs now the fishermen, and they divide the produce when they go for fishing in 60:40 ratio, and then sells the produce to the auctioneer. So sometimes they may have it in kind, but mostly they have in cash. So basically the next important supply chain entity comes into picture, which is the auctioneer. Now, auctioneer is another very interesting entity in this supply chain. Now, what role auctioneer play? Many of these auctioneer actually provides finances to the boat owner, because boat owner already have possibly a huge credit in the bank and had to pay back that money. So when a boat, when a trawler goes to the deep sea for a week or 5 days, there is huge necessity of fuel, food cost of fishermen, etc. That fund is advanced by the auctioneer, and when the the vessel comes back to the shore, the produce is sold to the auctioneer. So there is a subcontracting relation that exists between the auctioneer and the boat owner that he advances. Not all auctioneer advances, but we found several auctioneer advancing funds to the boat owner, and then boat owner selling back to the auctioneer. And then there is a auctioneer then sells to a merchant. And this merchant can be a company agent and can be a pure merchant and all. And this auctioneer and merchant, we found, have good kind of collusive agreement. They have often alleged of forming kind of some kind of a cartel, and then they fixes price, because the boat owner is through subcontracting is attached to this auctioneer. So these two entities has good market power and fixes price, and whatever price is then of the produce, which is now goes to the boat owner, and which is divided between the boat owner and the fishermen. Also, there are, if you have the export, then there are exporting agents come to the shore, and then they buy the product. So basically, boat owners can have different kinds of boat, and then it comes to the auctioneer, and then it can be merchants or some company agents, if it is a fish processing company which goes to export, and then it goes to export processing and then import agents. But if it is a domestic sale, then from merchants it goes to the retail vendors, etc. And in this part of the chain, there can be several intermediaries, because from the merchant they can go to one wholesaler, then it can go to another wholesaler in the local level, then it goes to the retailer. So this chain, part of the chain, can be quite long. Now, if we look at the final price, and through the interview we tried to have some kind of average estimate of the value, and in the total value, about 22% is got by the boat owners and fishermen, and they divide it into 60:40 ratio, and boat owners get about 13%. Auctioneer basically doesn't have much investment, gets 16%. Then the merchants and wholesaler and retailer. So between wholesaler, retailer, all these intermediaries get quite a bit of the value in the supply chain. Now, so we have now seen that there are several kind of intermediaries. Supply chain is lengthy. In the process, there is no bargaining power of the fishermen. They are the one who really does the hard work, but then there is not much bargaining power. And on the other hand, also because of the long supply chain and good share of wholesaler and retailer, consumer also play high price, as well as the quality also suffer, as there are informality and lengthy chain. So therefore, in this talk, I would focus on the fishermen. Also at the first point, point, and the last point, which is the consumer, to little bit in detail in the subsequently what I'm going to speak. Because this project, this seminar, they are talking about poverty and inequality, so I thought that it may be a good idea to have a kind of a fisherman perspective. Now, this is the whole chain I have put, but as I have explained, I will not go too much in detail. And the fisherman, the first point in the supply chain, if we look at then, we can theoretically, we can look at different theories of differential wages, where people argue that the negative aspect of a job can always be compensated by providing higher wages. And then to opposing that, the decent work framework of ILO came, where they argued for the protect of decent and productive work to have human dignity and also equity. So therefore, in that framework, we would like to look some of the issues of fishermen in my next part of the talk. So we have some survey of fishermen, but to have a more broader perspective at the all India level, I have looked at the National Sample Survey data, which is the government supplied data in India, which is employment unemployment survey, 68 round, and we have extracted unit record data for fisheries primary workers, not working in fish processing unit, who are basically go for fish catching fish. And mainly the sample consists of marine fisheries. You have semi-skilled, skilled and unskilled workers. The female workers are much lower, basically male worker. So if you look at the fisheries employment, there are permanent primary worker, there are secondary worker and tertiary worker. So these are the people who for the actual production place and fish catching basically. And this here we are looking at the people who are employed in this. So basically the first entity in our supply chain which has skilled, unskilled and miscellaneous worker, which are the administrators, managers, etc. So skilled workers, mainly they are in kind of catching fish, repairing nets. Unskilled worker help them, basically does the physical labor based work. Now, if you look at the earnings, you can see that the others category earns much higher than even the skill category. And these two parts are given, one is given in cash and the other part is given in kind. And if you look at the elementary worker, which earn much lower than the so-called skilled worker. And the cash and kind difference is also very much there, are less than 1/3 of what miscellaneous worker earn, and skilled worker earns about twice the amount of elementary worker. And cash versus kind also we see, as you are more unskilled, you are paid more in kind. But we concentrated also on poverty, and in India poverty is given by a headcount ratio vis-a-vis a poverty line, which is depends on kind of the minimum intake of calorie, which is a very kind of for a subsistence level you need. So it's a really low poverty line. But if we look at the income of the fisheries workers and then look at the poverty line, and we see that about 47% of the fisheries workers will be below poverty line. If we look at only the fisheries income. But if I look at the other incomes of the family, wife may be going for some work and all these together, then about 21%. This percentage is even worse in if you take agriculture in general, but little lower if we take all workers in India. So basically, if you have to survive with this hard work of fisheries, then you remain below 50%, almost remain below poverty. If we look at some of the decent work indicators, then also we see that there is a huge number of percentage of people are precariously employed, that is not having permanency, not having any kind of social security benefits and so on and so forth. So very huge are precariously employed, and therefore, one can see that this kind of people are who are the important producer of the segment is really gets a kind of deal which should improve. Similarly, I talked about social security benefit. Gender-wise, if you look at wages, there is difference, gender-wise difference, substantial difference in wages. But of course, wage may also be kind of lower. The work that women do may also be different, and because of which maybe also there is some wage differential. Now, we finally, important point is that the representation of workers and social dialogue through trade unions could have helped in such a case. But the problem that is occurring in case of trade unions is the following, that the trade unions also have affiliation with certain political parties. And when we went for the survey, there was certain important issues with respect to pairwise trawling by the trawlers and catching fish, juvenile fish, etc. And workers were protesting against that. But the important part of the workers' union was also belongs to the same political group as that of the ruling party in Kerala, and so they did not participate. And therefore, the whole protest by the fishermen actually fizzled out, and they could not put forth their degree. So the nexus between these boat owners who are also have political affiliation, and sometimes politicians do this in the in a different name, not in his name, and therefore it has a problem. So that's the issues I flagged for the fishermen. And then if I come to the consumers, then we see that there is this long supply chain, and because of this long supply chain, the hygiene goes down, price increases, etc. So we ask the question that if some of this work which were given to intermediaries, the fish processing farms themselves take up, will it be better? That will be definitely better for the consumers, but will it be profitable for the fish processing farm to do so? Is it profitable? Is it value addition is higher? We try to look at some of these issues. And for that, we have look at the theoretical framework of transaction cost, and Arne has already shown me the time, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But the data we have considered is annual survey of industries data, where we have the registered manufacturing units, and we took these years which were we found available on this fisheries processing unit farms, and we did certain analysis, and these farms are from this region where Kerala has the highest share, and they are primarily private farms, organized private farms, is about 18 to 50 years, etc. Now, the important question that we look at is this variable called distribution cost. So, many of these processing farms, they do not take up, they just process, sometimes clean, sometimes iced, and sometimes really process. But then they do not do this distribution and again give to another party to distribute. Some farms do so. So we try to look at whether the farms do distribution themselves will have higher value addition or not, or higher profit or not. Because if you look at value added, and if a farm does distribution on its own, it actually gets gets subtracted from the value added, that is the total output minus value of raw material. This item gets subtracted, but they may get better value of their product. So we try to see whether if distribution cost for a farm increases, ideally if it gets subtracted, value added should decline, but will value added increase because they get better value? And then with that we use other variables also, whether they use fish feed, use more preservatives, and what is the age, how distant they are from the consumer state, and fixed capital, ISO certification, etc. And the important result that we get here is the following, that we run a log linear regression, but distribution cost being a part of the GVA, it will have some relation with the GVA. Therefore, we took an instrumental variable for distribution cost by testing for endogeneity, and then we ran the regression, and we saw that distribution cost actually, if a farm internalizes the distribution and does the distribution on its own, then its gross value added actually increases. So we argue that farms should internalize this distribution part of it, rather than giving another set of intermediary who may not be very hygienic, who will be just truck owner and things like that, and then it may. So therefore, one can argue that these people actually, this processing farm actually should take up some of these activities in order to reduce the supply chain. We also get other variables such as age, which is experience being significant, and having better kind of too much of use of preservative giving lower value addition, etc. The results we get. And when we run this three also through profit, we get similar result, that distribution cost, if it internalize and take up the distribution on its own, then the profit also increases. Therefore, to conclude, therefore, that in the fisheries sector, therefore, as we saw, that there is this long supply chain, and in the process, the fisherman, the actual producer, and the final consumer, in a sense, pay the price. And therefore, if the supply chain can be reduced by bringing in some of the work being taken part by the formal agencies, such as the fish processing farm taking up, that can really give a better value. In the agriculture sector, we saw that happening in case of kind of contract farming, etc., where the contract farming, there are now farms which gives funding to the farmers directly and then take their produce and market, which is not the case in case of fisheries. So if this kind of trend comes in fisheries, where the processing farm also takes up this work, then the fisheries sector, the fishermen and the final consumer can benefit. Because when we look at the retail chain, because of not having time, I won't be able to explain so much, but the retail chain, which was retailing, which was earlier by head loaders, the women used to go home to home, has completely changed after liberalization, and now you have a kind of organized and unorganized retail chain, both prevailing. Interestingly, organized ones have not replaced the unorganized one, both prevailing, and you have multi-product supermarkets selling fisheries product, exclusive fish stores, then online retailing. All these channels are coming for fisheries products. So the fish processing farms, if they can come and take advantage of this emerging retail chain, then possibly they can benefit. And for that, support of credit or capital subsidies, because in developing country we always go for policy suggestion at the end, but this can, I think, help as well as the information dissemination. So if some of these steps are taken up and reduce the supply chain, then possibly a more efficient chain can develop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Finished in time?
Very good, thank you. Sorry, we allow some direct questions. Just and then we'll have a comment on the session at the end. So let me just comment myself to say that how is this relevant for the Norwegian context? And the relevance, we have of course the history of Norway with aid to Kerala and the fisheries sector, but nowadays of course the key issue is that India is a major economy in the global economy, so the fisheries sector is important. As you said, India is a major producer and in some segment a major exporter. The Indian market is still quite protected in other areas. So for Norway as an exporter, some segments are there are trade barriers. They are negotiating about tariffs for salmon and other stuff. So then it's important to be familiar with the Indian fisheries sector because we are interacting more, and India is a player as an exporter and importer actually. So that's why we have this as a component in these traders in the food value chain product to kind of get this knowledge about the dynamics and the political economy of the fisheries sector of India. Yes, please, you have the floor. Yes, we have to use the microphone because of the streaming.
We've been involved in developing processing of imported fish into India, both of us. And I think one issue which we as non-Indians fail to understand is, first of all, India is a country with a high proportion of vegetarians, which influences the consumption of fish per capita. The second one is still a dramatic lack of infrastructure in terms of distribution. And the third is related to wild catch. There is no aquaculture in India as such. So much of the fish caught along the Indian coast is wild catch, and it is seasonally related. You have the monsoon, of course, but we've been through many of the processing plants in Kerala, just to take that as an example, and our impression was that the utilization ratio of processing plants was down to 25%, which I think relates to the seasonal aspect of the fisheries. Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree with him that because of the lack of infrastructure part, and lack of infrastructure is one kind of reason what I talked about the hygiene and all getting. But the fish processing farms that you may have visited in Kerala are many of them are certified, EU certified, and some have good kind of infrastructure. And their utilization of capacity is really low. Seasonal nature is one aspect. Also lack of supply because the fish population is also declining. So therefore it is useful to have fish import. They argue that it is useful to have raw fish import and then process and then again sell back. But then there is this there are these tariffs issues and other issues which I have not looked so much detail as yet, which is my next kind of plan of work. And because of that, it's not so much is imported and processed and gone, because there is, when you import fish, the fisherman community also feels threatened. So in one of my earlier occasions when I went, it was fishermen were really going for big kind of strike because of this import of fish, and they feel that this fish will be at lower price, and then their share will go down substantially. But that need not necessarily be the case, because as you rightly pointed out, that there is enormous excess capacity of these fish processing units, and then they can process fish and completely can again export the imported fish. And domestic demand is, even though India, there large part of Indians are vegetarian, because our population is so huge that even part, if it is non-vegetarian, that itself in numbers is a huge number. So there is enormous demand, and price can come down. If the price comes down, there will be much higher level of demand. Price of fish is relatively high. Norwegian salmon, of course, the supermarket I visited for my survey sells Norwegian salmon, but the price is very high, means it is very difficult to purchase because of that. So therefore there is a kind of, if you increase production and efficiency, you may be able to reduce the price a little bit to improve demand. Aquaculture is coming up now. In a place like Andhra Pradesh and all, there is a kind of aquaculture is coming up in quite a big way. So I see prospect in that area.
Okay, one more question. Yes. You can present yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Tore Karstad. I'm representing Advanced Business Partner. Well, prices cost for import of salmon to India is 36% of customs tax. So that's one of the reasons that that is expensive, of course. But the fish hilsa is actually more expensive. So it's not the most expensive fish that is. But I have a question about the shortening about value chains. When we are exporting or importing salmon to India, it's a lot of bureaucracy, it's a lot of certificates that have been renewed all the time and so on. Is that the same for local fishermen and so on? Because if it's the same, that certainly will be an obstacle for that local fishermen can be able to enter the market.
I think that bureaucracy part is much more complicated for the export and import, because it goes through this officer, whereas in the domestic market it is that kind of officer is not there. There are some health officer who may visit your store and check up, but the customs officer and other officers, they are really, it's very difficult to get information about them. That thing is completely opaque, but that the kind of I presume that the kind of difficulties seen in international trade in terms of bureaucracy is not seen so much in the domestic kind of retailing of fish.
Okay, so thank you very much, Meenakshi. We'll bring this into the final stages of these traders in the food value chain. The project will run until the end of 2019. So we will kind of start preparing for the final stages, final conferences, wrapping up publications, etc. So this will surely be a valuable input. So thank you very much.
This is one publication which came out from this project on decent work of fisheries worker. And another publication we are trying to publish and communicating with journal about this second part of distribution cost paper. And we plan to more publication based on this research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll try to be strict on timing with myself. So I'll talk about food price differences across Indian states, patterns and determinants. And the motivation is that first, the interstate price differences in India are large. So they are important for food production. they are important for trade, they are important for understanding India's development. So to the right there, you see the the paths of regional inequality, income inequality across Indian states. The blue curve is you see the red curve is in current prices, and the blue one in fixed prices. So you see that the price adjustment makes a big impact on how you interpret India's development. So in current prices, it looks as if regional disparities came to a kind of maximum and then started slightly declining. Whereas when you adjust for the prices, the picture is a bit less positive. So there is still some increase in regional disparities, which you see have increased really a lot in the kind of growth trajectory of India since 1993. So understanding price gaps and price changes is quite vital for understanding India as such. And of course, food prices are kind of key for the poor. So, and it's a hot issue in India, of course, if what happens to the food prices. It's also an issue that for large countries like India, different from Luxembourg, the domestic regional issues are kind of vital in a completely different sense. This is one of my own research interests, but there is little data on the trade between the states of India. You don't have complete data because a lot of the trade is by car, by road, and there is no systematic registration of the trade flow. So actually prices are a very useful source of information about the determinants and drivers of interstate differences and developments. So why do prices differ across states? It's I draw on the international literature. There is some research on intranational price differences, especially in large countries like USA, Russia, China, for example, and Brazil. There is research on this too. So there is some research on the domestic, but there is a large literature on international price differences, and some of the themes are kind of common. So the international literature sheds light on the domestic too. So you have some you have the income-related explanations that rich countries have higher price levels, which is a systematically observed phenomenon internationally. So, and then the classical approach was the so-called Samuelson hypothesis, saying that for tradable goods prices are equalized across nations, but non-tradable services prices differ. So then the price levels are lower in countries with cheap services. There could also be quality differentiation between products as another link between income and prices. And you could also have pricing to markets and different kind of search patterns and markets in poor and rich countries. Then you have the trade-related explanations of price difference, where you would say that the kind of frictions or trade barriers between markets kind of limit the price difference. If there are no barriers at all, things move freely, like dollars, currencies. You don't have big price differences for dollars, for example. But for goods, you have barriers, and so if markets are segmented, that would drive price different. If there is no trade, prices could be very different, and there could be a value chain effect here, because if you have an apple or a fish from one country to the other, it's not only the physical product, but you have a large services component in the final product, distribution, product development, whatever, along the value chain. So yeah, so the international literature guides. It's kind of funny to do this from Norway, because here you see on the right there this curve from the International Comparison Program. That's the national price levels for food and non-alcoholic beverages for 181 countries. So there you see, so there you have India. So India is the cheapest in the world. And there you have Norway. It's the most expensive in the world. So that's for food and beverages. If you go to consumer goods in general, Norway is beaten by Switzerland and Bermuda, so we have a third place. I'm not sure how India fares, but India is the cheapest in the world, and an issue for India, also related to Menakshi's presentation, is this a good place to have, in a way? Should India be so cheap? So what will happen when India modernizes, when you get cooling systems for the fish, when you get a lot of stuff in not the head, what do you call that? The head, the ones carrying the fish in the street side, the street vendors. When you get big supermarkets, lots of people handling cargo and the shelves and cleaning, etc. Would that raise prices? Is that kind of an objective? So in India, it's a kind of very controversial thing. If prices increase, you have a kind of big debate. So that's, but it's a kind of developmental issue whether prices will stay like this or change. So should India, for example, have more trade in food? I had this colleague in India, he said that India should have a free trade agreement with itself. Because there is friction, there are bad roads, it's 30 kilometers per hour, limited cooling system for the food. How does it affect the prices and the differences across regions? So I'm kind of interested in this kind of regional heterogeneity of India, because this is so important for the larger countries. So I made a book which is just published about free trade agreements and the world economy, which is an entirely different area, but also there I decomposed all the large nations in this world economy model used, because that's quite important. You don't treat Russia like Luxembourg, and not China and India. So, I think I have to speed up, so, okay. Yeah, so this paper, I get some water so that my throat thrives. So this paper presents new data evidence for India based on the household surveys for all food products, where we have the value and the quantity for each product, and we by product and state for 3 different years. And then as a second source of information, I used National Horticultural Board data on wholesale and retail prices for selected fruit and vegetable products, selected to be kind of homogeneous products that you can compare across states, etc. So the wholesale prices are for the wholesale market, the mandis, and the retail prices from retail outlets in the same areas. So theoretically, it's a bit eclectic. So I say, okay, the income-related explanations matter, the trade-related explanations matter. I don't have a kind of single-minded, just one model trying to prove it, but look for different drivers. So and it's a descriptive analysis plus some analysis of determinants. And there is a working paper here, and I will make a journal version to submit for publication. By the way, I mentioned Carl Rich. There is number 870 is from Carl Rich. So if you want to read about the potatoes of Bihar, you can read that one too. So so I use for the descriptive analysis, I use the Gini coefficients that facilitate weighting, so that the small states of Northeast India don't weigh as heavily as Uttar Pradesh and the big states. And it gives some kind of comparability, and this curve shows. I think we just have to. I'm very sorry. Yes. Okay. Yeah, we lost that one. So, so this curve to the right, it shows if the prices across Indian states are monotonously increasing from the low to the top, what will be the Gini coefficient? So if the highest price is 10 times the lowest, the ratio is 10 to 1, then you will have a Gini of 0.28 or something. If it is 3 times larger, you will have 0.24 or so. If it's the top is twice the bottom, which is a considerable difference. I mean, in Norway, for example, the carrots in Tromsø, they could be perhaps a little more expensive than Oslo, but they're not twice as expensive generally. So, so you have this. So this is the metric used, and this is the example, just an example of potatoes in India, where you see that the big you have a lowest at 8.33, a top at 23 rupees per kilogram, and this gives a Gini of 0.15. So, and the big producing states have the lower prices, which is not by accident, of course. So you have Bihar, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh. So what will happen if you have kind of free trade in potatoes? What will be the prices in Bihar? Probably from a trade perspective, you expect that then the prices would increase in Bihar, and they would be lower in the other states that get better access. So that's an issue. So if you look at all these 113 products for the National Sample Survey Organization data, these are the kind of this is the distribution for the Ginis for each product. And you see that the median was 0.17, which is pretty high, and it declined to 2009-10, and same in 2011-12. And the mean is a bit higher. The minimum is very low, sugar and salt, etc., very easily transportable goods. And the maximum is very high, which is in some goods you have really a big price gap. So we find dry fruits, cereals on top, fresh fruit, vegetable high, kind of perishable goods, perhaps a high transaction cost. Interesting, some of these staple goods are very low. Interesting that the public distribution system items have bigger dispersion than the others. So public intervention didn't cut the price gaps. And there is an income price correlation, which you see in this diagram. Here's the per capita income, and here's the relative food price level for the state. So you see there is clearly an increasing relationship here with the poor states having, the poor have low prices. So the price gaps are kind of pro-poor. And there is some trend towards declining price dispersion over time. The second source is this National Horticulture Board wholesale and price data. 31 market areas in 23 states got the help from ISEC to compile the data. But so one of the reasons for doing this is the excellent supply of data in India on prices. There is no data on trade between states, but excellent data on price. So we have monthly data. That was something. What happened? Yeah, monthly data for 2004 to 15. Retail prices from later. 11 products. Some of them are split into different subgroups. So they are homogeneous, match NSSO categories, so we can compare. Large consumption, we don't take marginal items, and we have production data, which is important for the analysis of causes. And so we are interested in the price gaps across market states, and not the dynamics over time, because these prices, they fluctuate a lot according to the seasons and stuff. So this is not the focus here. So this is these are some results from the NHP data. You see that, so this diagram shows the ratio between the NSSO unit values, that is the consumer prices registered in the household survey, and the wholesale and retail prices. So the retail prices should in principle be the same as the NSSO unit values, okay? So the ratio should be about 1. And this light blue shows that this is kind of almost true. So there is a good match between NSSO data and the NHB data. Then, of course, the retail prices are above the wholesale prices, which should be lower because they are lower in the value chain. So, and you see this is true, and it's but the ratio varies. On average, the retail prices are 50–60%, but there is a good correspondence with the NSSO data. So then to the determinants, as I said, we check for eclectically for different drivers. So the dependent variable in this analysis is the relative price compared to the all India average for each of these 11 or 15 items. And this variable is by state, product, and year. So it's product specific. Then we have trade-related variables, and there we would have liked to have data on imports and trade, but we don't have it, so we have to find some trick, and I'll tell you about it. We have to find some indirect way. And I create an index for distance to production in other states, and I'll explain that in the next slide. So it's the kind of proximity to the supply. Then we have the own share of all India production for the state, that's own supply. So Bihar for potatoes is expected to have a downward influence on the prices, or kind of abundant supply. This is also by state product year. Then we have the relative per capita income, which is of course by state year, so we don't, that is not at the product level. And we have other control and ad hoc included variables. The size of the state measured by population can be affected by the scale or competition in the markets. Relative consumption shares. There is an interesting paper by Atkin showing that this kind of home bias in consumption. So if you produce a lot of potatoes, you tend to have a taste for potatoes. So this is surely matters. So we check for that. We have a peripherality index. Do the peripheral data even higher prices? And we check for the size of the wholesale markets when we use the NHB data. So we are interested in the cross-section, so we have pooled data, not a panel, which kind of wipes out the cross-section effect. And this is the trick for taking into account trade without trade data. So you have this standard in trade, you have this very robust empirical relationship that trade between two countries or states, J and I, is a function of the sizes and the distance between them. So, and typically you get this close to 1 and this close to -1 in all the gravity regressions. There are thousands of them. So if we aggregate for a country, we find that the trade of country I is a function of this sum of size divided by distance. And so this is the inspiration for this DISPROD, distance to production index, which is the share of each other state, not the own state, but the share of other states weighted by distance. We have a constant here since distance is very low in some cases. It's just to make it more well-behaved. So it's a kind of measure of constructed imaginary trade. And this turns out to be a very strong determinant of price differences. And I have to, yeah, I think I managed. So yeah, so this is an example of regressions where you see that most of our expectations are actually confirmed. So producers like the potato ones we saw, they have lower prices. The distance to other suppliers, the closer you are to supply, the lower prices you have. The production consumption ratio, which is the more relative production you have, is a kind of double check on this production influence, has a negative impact. And the relative consumption share compared to all India has a positive. So it kind of drive, if you are more keen on potatoes, it kind of tends to pull up the price, which is also intuitive. And the per capita income is positive, as expected. But this is, the formula was not significant. So the Atkin story is kind of not confirmed in this regression. But the per capita income is strongly confirmed that rich states have higher prices. The peripherality weakly confirmed, and it's kind of ambiguous. One would expect peripheral regions to have higher prices, but it's kind of very weak. Big states have lower prices, could be competition or scale, not sure. As I said, this is kind of eclectic in this sense. And infrastructure, not significant in this version. And we have time and product dummies, but not state dummies, because but we run it with state dummies, and then these variables that are not product-wise tend to be wiped out. Yes. So this is an illustration of the importance, where you say, what is the impact of one standard deviation change for each variable? And then you see this distance to other suppliers, which is a kind of proxy measure for trade, is the strongest determinant of price gaps. Size is an important determinant. We didn't have a theory for it, actually. But there is something about size which affect prices. The income level, which is expected from the income-related hypothesis, is important. Own production is important. And this production consumption ratio is confirmed. These three are actually not so robust, and they're not in. This is all simple regressions, but with the robust standard errors, these are not significant too. So these are less important, lowest ranked. But you see that kind of our expectations are grossly confirmed. When we have state dummies, some of the state year variables kind of drop out, but these product-wise variables here, they like distance, on production, production consumption, they kind of survive. So we get some kind of robust support for that. Yes, so with state dummies, the state year variables are not so significant greatly. And there's a lot of variation in the distance to supply variable across products. So for some, some products are on top. And there are more details in the papers. I don't get very clear results on the drivers of change over time. Maybe the data is kind of too limited, probably to measure it properly. And competition issues is not kind of fully accounted for in the analysis. For example, changes in the mandis, the Indian structure of the wholesale markets, the regulations have changed during the period, so there could be some effects there which are not accounted for. Yeah, so food price differences are large and matter strongly for producer and consumer prices. They are important for food security and statistics policy. And you see the trade-related and income-related explanations both matter, and the trade-related explanation seems stronger according to these results. So lower trade costs between states could promote efficiency and lead to an overall gain, but there would be winners and losers according to the standard kind of trade logic. So the potato guys, so the potato producers don't have to sell all their potatoes or so much in the whole market. So that would drive up the prices in the producing states. So you have a kind of producer-consumer redistribution, and vice versa in the importing states, which would vary by product. So, yeah. So finally, about is India's food price dispersion high or low in international comparison? So we saw that India has the lowest price level in the world. But I made a comparison to take countries with the same income span as the Indian states. And so the Gini for food dispersion across these countries was 0.15, which is exactly in the range we find for India. So in a sense, the states of India are similar to countries in the income range of India when it comes to price dispersion. So it's not astronomically high. compared to the pattern between countries. On the other hand, it's important to know that India is not integrated because the poor countries of the world are not strongly integrated. So there is a kind of integration issue within India. Possibly the prices of food in India should rise. So if the income rises, prices will rise. So I think it's a dubious role to be number one on the ICP ranking. So that's it. Okay. So yes, I was not too bad. So we have 3 minutes for. Well, we started a bit, but if you have any direct questions, we can revert to this in the final session. We'll have some wraps and coffee now, but if you have any immediate questions, there's room for it now. I think then we take the wraps.
Small question. The
Yeah.
price that you have taken.
Yeah.
The price that you have taken, you show it for a year. Is it an average over the year, or seasonal variations are taken into account?
Well, of course, for the NSSO data, the price is for a year. For each survey is covering it. So, but for the NHP data, it's annualized, because I'm not analyzing because it's a lot of fluctuation in these prices. So this is not the focus here about when top season and low season.
Dispersion may be quite high at certain season and
Yeah.
maybe lower at certain season.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's the variations are kind of huge when you look at the detailed data, because they have low and high seasons. So the deliberate choice is to annualize them, to kind of wipe out a lot of this more detailed price fluctuations. Yes. Okay, so then we will have some wraps and some coffee, and we start again in 15 minutes. And we are on time. Our next speakers are, we are ready with the streaming too? Yes, okay. So our next speakers have their PhDs in sociology from the University of Oslo, is that right? Yes. They are senior researchers at the National Institute for Consumer Research. Unni Kjærnes has focused on food consumption issues in her research as one major theme. Arne Dulsrud has worked on various consumer-related, economically related issues. He has also been the general director. He's a research director at SIFO, which is the Norwegian acronym. He's a research director now. He has also been the general director of SIFO for 6 years, and they will present work in the food sec project with the title with the theme Food Consumption and Poverty: Evidence from Bihar and Karnataka. So, welcome.
Thank you. First of all, Arne, I will thank you for hosting this seminar and giving the opportunity to present this data outside the ivory tower of the university, so to speak. And I think that our findings have relevance outside of the academics. And this paper is written together with 3 colleagues. It's Unni, who will co-present with me. And there are our colleagues at CUTS International, which is consumer organization in Rajasthan. And that is Veena Vidyadharan and Susan Matthew. The main topic of our research is food security in India. And I think Arne has given an introduction to the product that was funded by the Research Council of Norway. And this consists of very many parts, and our part actually is about food security in households. And I think this picture is taken from fieldwork we had in Bihar, in the northern part of Bihar, illustrates some of the paradoxes that we're going to study. On the one hand, Bihar is one of the poorest states in India. There are food insecurity, but on the other hand, it has high agricultural output and high agricultural export as well. A little bit about the background. And I should not use too much time about this because this is an enlightened assembly, and I think you know most about this. The impacts of climate change in India is very high due to its very high variety of natural conditions. And this year is, of course, not an exception, talking about heat waves and about floods, both in the north and in the south. They have a high portion of the world's poor, which makes them particularly vulnerable. And of course, this affects whole food security. And we are using the FAO's definition of food security, which encompasses availability, that is supply, access, which is about purchasing power, use, which is about preparation of food and about nutrition, nutritional composition of the food, and stability, which is access to food over time. So that's our 4 pillars of food security, so to speak. There are other factors affecting food security as well, and that is, of course, an economic growth that has been impressive in the last 20 years. Also, according to the World Bank outlook, it has been a real vanguard when it comes to economic growth in a global sense as well. There is an increase in agricultural production and exports for staples and fruit. And there are also a number of reforms from the Indian government that was aimed or addressing food security as a long row of reforms, starting with the food or the minimal price system, ending up with the Food Security Act, and it's also been an issue at WTO. And they nearly halted the Doha process, and I think our colleague at NUPI will know more about this than I do, but that was in 2014, illustrating that food security is a hot issue in Indian politics. But food security is still high. And when we address the public health indicators, we can look at the intake of micronutrients, it's malnourishment, it's underweight, and it's anemia as well. And this has led our partner in this project, which is International Food Policy Research Institute in India, to conclude that there is an agricultural nutrition disconnect. This means that on the one hand, we have an agricultural growth in India, but at the same time, this seems to provide quite a weak engine for vulnerable people to improve their food security. So, why is this so? I mean, this is a very complex question, of course, but I think the project today have addressed some of those issues about distribution, about trade, and about logistics. So, but our aim is actually to dive deep into the macro level, into the household, to see actually how the household reacts and how they handle the food insecurity. And there are, on the one hand, a lot of data on the household about nutritional intake from the National Statistics Bureau. And there's a lot of data on how climate change affects agricultural output. But there's little data on how people actually provide their food. So that is some of the main issues in this research. We have evidence from Bihar and Karnataka. And I think by focusing on those two states, we are able to elaborate some of our explanations. Because Bihar they're affected by floods. They have high food insecurity. It's food governance, and it's a poor state. Contrasted to Karnataka, which is affected mostly by drought. At any rate, in the area where we did our fieldwork, which is north of Bangalore in Raichur, which is up here. And in Bihar, we conducted the fieldwork close to the Nepal border. They are very different when it comes to governance as well. I mean, Bihar is one of the usual suspects when it comes to poor governance, whereas Karnataka is one of the clever pupils in the class. We are using a theoretical approach that is actually inspired by the work of Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize laureate. And his main idea is that in order to improve their food security, you should have entitlements related to land, employment, and income. And we look at, so to speak, the combination of those entitlements in order to make a model that we can use for other contexts as well, not only in India. And when it comes to the formal entitlements, we are looking particularly closer at the public distribution system, the PDS, which is already mentioned in the presentation by Arne. We'll look closer to the midday meal scheme, to the ICDS system, which is the maternal care system in India, and the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which guarantee a minimum income for rural households, and the National Food Security Act. And we conducted a survey in both districts and slums, 18 villages. Well, you can read about this in our paper, so I will not go into details, but it says something about the structure of our empirical work. And we had a questionnaire that was based on so-called 24-hour recall, which is used in very many cases when you're going to map the eating pattern of whole households, which asks what did you have for eating the last 24 hours. So that is a very effective way of approaching the food pattern issues. And we had quite a long questionnaire. I don't remember how many questions it was, about more than 100, about food consumption practices, procurement, where they got their food, about their social background, and their own estimates of social security. And of course, we had indicators of vulnerability in our sample, both when it comes to literacy, the low cost, the monthly income. You know, it's a very high proportion belonging to lower income section of the population. A lot of them had migrant work in their household, and of course, casual employment was very high here. That was also illustrated by your introduction from the fisheries. So this means that I'm leaving the word to my colleague, Unni.
Okay. I should say that in terms of efficiency, the 24-hour recall is perhaps not the most efficient, but it allows us to contextualize, to ask other questions. Where did it come from? What happened, etc. So that's why we chose it. The first slide here is about what they had to eat yesterday in these households, and most meals included some kind of staple, or sometimes two. And with a staple here means mainly rice and wheat. In Bihar, we also found that potatoes were significant. In Karnataka, it was ragi, which is a type of grain, more traditional grain. As you can see, there are some variations here. One is between the states, and we found that in Bihar there were many more people. We don't talk about significance here because the sample is too small. Many more people having eaten only twice than in Karnataka. And the urban samples also had eaten less often than the urban samples. And the urban samples are, since it's from the slums, it's a more biased sample. It's the poorest. But you can't live only on staples. Dal is a significant addition. Beans and of various kinds, lentils. And there we find even more variation, especially between Karnataka and Bihar. And as you can see, most people had dal for their meals in a curry or something. In Karnataka, not in Bihar. So, and the addition of other things was very, very limited. And we found that hardly anyone had any animal protein. And this is not just because of that they were vegetarians. Many, in these samples, many poor people are not vegetarians. So that was not the reason. And they didn't have any dairy either. So we asked about the stability of the supply. This asking about yesterday is a snapshot. And as you can see, in the rural areas, the dark blue columns show the proportions saying they always had enough. And in all places, a lot of people did not. But it's clearly higher in rural Karnataka than in rural Bihar. And there is a very serious lack of food food insecurity from their own judgment in the urban slums. And we ask why. And as you can see, the light blue columns, from the light blue columns, income. Lack of income is the main reason. And or illness, which is sort of drought, flood is not very important. A bit more in Karnataka than Bihar, and there are explanations for that. This is a very complicated chart, but we asked, where did you buy the food in the recent couple of weeks? And when it comes to wheat and rice, most of it was sourced from the PDS, the subsidized food, public subsidized food shops, especially in the rural areas. Ragi, not part of the program, bought in local shops. All the other food items like pulses, dal, vegetables, ghee, oil, milk, then the local market was the most important. Any kind of sort of community sharing is quite insignificant, apart from milk in the rural districts, and that's probably because they had a cow and then it's fresh and they shared with their neighbors sometimes. But it was very insignificant in what they had eaten on the day before. What is also very noticeable is that these are rural food producing areas. These are rural villages. And it's not much coming from own production, especially in Bihar. So that didn't count much. It's the public distribution system and local shops, not own production. And these are very tiny, and even they didn't have a back garden to grow vegetables, hardly any. And this can be shown here. We asked whether they're involved in were involved in farming activities and in the rural areas, and about a little less than 2/3 were. But as you can see, especially in Bihar, they worked as agricultural laborers. They didn't have any land at all. And also in Bihar, not in Karnataka, there were more people doing sharecropping than owning land. So this is at least one reason why own production mattered so little. Then, of course, they could sell the food, but few farms were big enough for that. As I said, the public distribution system is crucial. To buy subsidized food, you need a ration card, and the ration cards are distributed based on census data. But I know these are old, and the records have holes in them, and this is what we see here. Below poverty line they have a certain ration to a certain price. Above that, there are above poverty line cards, but we could focus here on BPL and Antodaya, which is the poorest of the poor. And if we look at we add those holding an Antodaya card with households owning a BPL card, we see that in rural Karnataka, nearly everybody had a card like that. It's also high in rural Bihar, but in the urban slums, where people had the poorest food, there is a large proportion, especially in the Bihar slum, who don't have a card. 58%. and they were really so poor. Here we asked about the satisfaction with the fair price shops, because there have been lots and lots of scandals about that. Corruption of many kinds and inefficiencies. But as you can see, especially in Karnataka, there are quite a few being satisfied. And even in rural Bihar. And one reason for that is probably that there have been significant improvements. Even though it's not perfect, it's improved. And they complain mainly about the quantities, but also about quality. And that sort of is probably both for many people. But in the urban locations, and especially in Bihar, the main complaint, which was not part of our questionnaire, was that they didn't have a card. And when we asked about income, it was so low that they should clearly have been entitled to a card, an Antodaya card. So this is a very clearly an issue. Another public service is the midday meal program in schools. And here we see that we asked whether it has happened in the last month that a midday meal was not served. And as you can see, this is a problem in many places. The don't knows is if they don't have children, and if the informant was not informed about that. But as you can see, that is a problem, but it is important as an additional source of food for school children. So, summing up, what people eat is, of these people eat, is highly staple dominated, very monotonous diet. And here we have claims for example, Jean Dress and Deaton, that the PDS system has provided calories, yes, but it has reduced the variation in the diet. And perhaps that's also what we see in terms of nutritional problems, because caloric deficiencies are not that common anymore. And there are no big crises. But these major nutritional deficiency is like vitamin A and iron are very dominant. And for dal, there's a big difference between Karnataka and Bihar, and in Karnataka, in some places, dal is included in the PDS system. And in Bihar, they even had few meals, which must mean that some households clearly had too little calories as well. And it was not very nutritious, especially for children. Potatoes are good and nutritious, but they contain lots of water. So for children, that is not dense enough. And the stability, 2/3 did not always have enough food. When it comes to availability and access, strong dependence on public distribution for rice and wheat, but no, it's important to see that for any other food item, which is also crucial, they rely on local markets. Own production of very limited importance in this study. So, coming back then to the bundles of entitlements. So because it's not either or, it's not either the market or public distribution, it's how it comes together. And dependence on subsidized food, which has improved when we look at earlier studies. It has clearly improved, but it's not sufficient. Income is as an entitlement is much more important than owning land, because that's too limited. And then we come back to the lack of permanent contracts, etc., and the instability. So the functioning of local markets is crucial. And putting this together leads us to conclude that entitlements seem to be cumulative rather than complementary. So this Bihar slum, this devastated slum, they were those lacking these public social rights, which were much better enforced in the much richer, much better functioning Karnataka. Okay, thank you. Yeah, here are some publications from the study.
Okay, so thank you very much, Arne and Uni. Any immediate questions in this area? If not, we will revert to it in half an hour. And just let me say that some of these issues, for example, about income versus entitlement in the form of land ownership, is a kind of a generic issue. For example, it's related to, for example, the trade area where I'm working. If you have free trade, you bid up prices for the producers, so it's good for all the farmers, so they get more food because they get more income. On the other hand, the prices may increase some other places, so some net importers and consumers have to pay more. So this is also a theme in our next presentation from Fenella, actually, this issue about income and access effects related to food. So this is a kind of generic issue. Thank you very much. So Fenella Carpena, she did her PhD in economics at Berkeley a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, yes, and then she came to NUPI, worked at NUPI for a while, and she joined our project at a late stage. So well, my work and the work of Arne Ulsrud and Uni was presented in Delhi in 2016. Fenella's work is even more recent, and so it's the first time you have the chance to hear about it. So, and Fenella now works at Oslo Met, and you have the floor. Yes.
Thank you. I had some trouble with getting this into full view, Fenella. Can you open it in PDF instead of on? Because I think you opened it in Internet Explorer. Yeah, open it with Adobe or something. Yeah, and then there should be, I think, yeah. Okay, thank you. Is it? Okay. Thanks very much, Arne, for the introduction. So this is a paper that I think actually ties very nicely with the previous paper by Arne and Uni about food security in India. But I'm more interested, or at least in this paper, I'm interested in the impact of basically just the changing climate on how on food security, and I'm going to look at this question in particular in the context of rural India. And whereas the previous paper focused on 2 states, I'm going to use nationally representative data to try to look at this question. So, so basically the idea is to kind of see how droughts is going to impact not only the amount of food that people eat, but also the nutritional value of the types of food that they're eating. So as the previous paper by Arne and Uni has documented, food security is still one of the most pressing development challenges today, even though there has been a lot of strides that have been made over the last decades. So for instance, in 2013, recent estimates suggest that almost 850 million people experience chronic hunger. And these challenges in achieving food security are even made severe by the changing climate. So in particular, there studies have shown that the frequency and the intensity and the duration of droughts are expected to increase in the coming years. And so to try to create policy that will try to mitigate the potential negative effects of climate change in the future, it's going to be important to understand how these types of extreme weather events impact not only the availability of food, but also the nutrition and the stability of access to food. So as they've mentioned, food security is a multidimensional concept. So there are four pillars that they've described previously. So one is availability, which means the amount of food that there is. There's access, which refers to things like income and prices. There's utilization, which is what I'm going to focus on in this paper, which is about the nutritional value of food. And then finally, there's stability, which is the household's ability to cope with negative shocks, such as droughts, for example. So there are these multidimensional features of food security, but even so, the existing literature on this issue, on the impacts of climate change on food security, is actually highly skewed. So there is a large body of research that shows that if there is a drought, so there's low rainfall, agricultural yields and productivity is going to fall. But if you look at the types of articles that look at the relationship between food security and climate variability since 1990, 70% of them look at food availability. So for instance, the effect of droughts on food production, but there's only 14% that consider food utilization. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this paper. So in this paper, I have two questions. The first is to try to understand how droughts influence not only the food expenditure of households, but also the quality of the diet and the macronutrient intake. So I'm mainly going to focus on macronutrients. So that's going to be energy consumption, protein consumption, fat consumption. And then in the second stage, to try to understand the role that prices and income play as a channel for these effects. So as I mentioned, I'm going to look at this question in the context of the rural setting in India. And rural India is actually a very interesting setting and a very useful setting for addressing these questions for several reasons. One is that I think almost the majority of households, so I think around 70 or 80%, work in agriculture. And in India, much of agriculture is still actually rain-fed. And so in a context where much of agriculture relies on how much rainfall there is, we can expect droughts to have significant implications for the availability of food. In addition, there's actually also large variability across time and over space in India, which allows us to try to understand. We can compare one area that has lots of rainfall with another area which doesn't have a lot of rainfall and kind of see what the differences are. And one thing that's really nice about India also is that a lot of data is available through the National Sample Survey. And it's there's a consumer and expenditure module of the survey, which is collected almost every year. And it has rich household data on food consumption, which includes not only market purchases, but also home production. And there's over 300 food items in this data set. And this is also collected nationally, so it covers all of the districts of India, for example. Okay, so just to give a short preview of the main results that I find in the paper. So basically, droughts are going to have a significant negative effect in the amount of food that people eat. And that significant negative effect is actually present in all types of food. So not just cereals, but also fruits and vegetables, processed foods, and animal products. So there's a negative effect across the board in food expenditure in different types of food groups. Importantly, the quality of the household diet is also negatively impacted. So as Arne and Uni has shown, most households actually rely on cereals. Most of their consumption is coming from cereal products. And what I see in the analysis is that when droughts hit, households rely on grain products even more. So it's already monotonous, like as Uni had mentioned, and becomes even more monotonous during a drought. And part of that is because the fact that cereals tend to be cheaper source of calories. This negative effect, as I will argue later on, the negative effect on total food expenditure and nutrition, I would argue, is likely operating through income rather than prices. So it also echoes what Uni has discussed and Arne has discussed, that one of the main reasons of food insecurity that people have said was the lack of income. And so this lack of income becomes even graver during times of drought. And also, as I mentioned, the relative prices will influence how households allocate their budget during a drought. So they will, I see that households tend to shift towards cheaper sources of calories and cheaper sources of nutrition during a drought, and those tend to be grains. So basically, if I could sum it up in one sentence, the situation in rural India is already very bad, and when droughts hit, it just becomes even worse. And I think these kinds of ideas have important implications for policy, in particular to highlight that attaining food security during a drought probably will require an integrated approach, because we need to focus not just on the quantity of food, but also on the quality of food. So for instance, there has been, as in the previous presentation, they were talking about a lot of different programs that are available. So for instance, the public distribution system, the midday meals, the Right to Food Act that provides people with a guaranteed amount of grains per month. So my results would highlight that those types of programs are important for achieving food security, but it's also important to understand that for instance, the Right to Food Act only provides grains, and so it's important to understand that simply providing grains might not be enough to really achieve not just food security, but nutrition security as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, the goal of the paper is to try to understand the impact of droughts on food consumption. So I'll need two sets of data. One is a measure of droughts, and another is a measure of food consumption. So my measure of droughts, I'm going to use rainfall data from Wilmot and Matsuura, which is a couple of earth science researchers from the University of Delaware. And they produce a data set that is global terrestrial precipitation. So it's a measure of precipitation across the globe. Oh, so this data is gridded at 0.5 and 0.5 degrees. So what that means is basically, if you look at 60.25 degrees latitude and 10.75 degrees longitude, so that's kind of like where the center of Oslo is. And then from there, you can move 0.5 degrees each time. So then I also observe, for instance, what the rainfall level is at 60.75 degrees latitude, et cetera, et cetera. And so because the data of rainfall are available at grid points, one methodological question is how to match that data that is at grid points into levels of rainfall for districts. So what I do is, for a given district, I take the centroid of the district, so kind of like the center of the district, and then I find the grid point in the rainfall data that is closest to that district, and I assign that as the level of rainfall in the district. And so once I've done that, I basically constructed a measure of a dry shock, which I'm defining here basically as the absolute deviation of rainfall in meters per year from the district's long run mean, which is the 40-year period since before 2012. So what this means basically in practice is, let's take a district, I'm gonna call it District A. If the average annual rainfall over the 40-year period in that district is 1 meter, and then in 2009, I see that there's only 0.2 meters of rainfall during that year, then there's a dry shock of 0.8 meters because it was 0.8 meters below what was usual. So it's basically, you can just think of this as the dry shock basically as a measure of how much lower rainfall was than the usual for that period. The second component of the analysis is to use data on household food consumption. And for this, I'm going to use the NSS Consumer and Expenditure Surveys, which was almost annual from 2004 to 2012. So this is a set of surveys that is collected by the National Sample Survey, which is a government organization. And it asks households to report how much they spent, for instance, on potatoes in the last 30 days, and also how much quantity they consumed. So then the household would say, okay, I spent 100 rupees on potatoes in the last 30 days, and I consumed 3 kilograms. And so this data, as I mentioned, is very, very exhaustive. It has over 300 food items. And so because I'm interested in kind of the nutritional value of what people are eating, one important point is to try to see from this data set the nutritional value of consumption. So I do that basically by using a nutrition chart, which is based on the National Institutes of India as well. So this chart will basically say, okay, 1 kilogram of potato, for instance, has 967 calories, 17 grams of protein, and 1 gram of fat. So then basically from the household survey, which says the household ate, let's say, 2 kilograms of potato in the last 30 days, I'm going to multiply that, for instance, by 17 grams to say that in total, the household consumed 34 grams of protein from potatoes in the last 30 days. So there's, obviously that's not a perfect approach. This simple accounting exercise, there's going to be issues about households who maybe take meals away from home because they eat from their employer, or households who provide food to their neighbors. And so I kind of make some adjustments for that. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to go through that today. So in addition to data on rainfall and household consumption, I also have some data on prices and wages, actually, and that's coming from a data set that's called the Rural Price Collection Survey, which is also a survey that's collected by National Sample Survey Organization of India. And what this survey does is basically it sends enumerators to go to different markets, specified markets, so that's about 600 markets in 26 states, to kind of survey what the prices of goods are in those markets. And this is also actually the data set that is being used to construct the Consumer Price Index for India. And in addition, I have data on crop production. For instance, the kilograms of potato per year that were produced in a particular district, that's coming from the Ministry of Agriculture. And then finally, I use data from the census, mainly as what in the statistical analysis would be control variables. These are basically would be kind of like demographic variables, like the literacy rate or the whether, for instance, there's electricity available in the villages. So there's 300 food items in the data set. And what I do is to be able to try to kind of collapse that into some type of analysis that we can digest. I group it into 6 categories of food items. And this is not, categories that I just came up with. It's also following what is being done from the National Sample Survey Organization. So there's 6 categories. So the first category would be cereals. So that would be rice, wheat, maize. Second would be pulses, nuts, and oilseeds. So that would be dal, lentils, and some walnuts, vegetables and fruits, animal-sourced foods, so meat, dairy, and fish, and also seafood. Fifth category will be sugar, honey, oils, and fats. So it will be basically sugar that's added to food. So brown sugar, white sugar, and also oils and fats. So visible fats that are being used for cooking, like cooking oils and butter. And then finally, it's going to be the last category is processed food and beverages. So anything that's, for instance, bottled, like drinks, or canned bread that you buy at the store, for instance, and biscuits. So here's some summary statistics from the first year of data that I used. So this is from 2004 to 2005. And so as I mentioned, from the data, I try to back out the amount of calories and the amount of protein and the amount of fat that the household consumes. And so I have here food expenditure, calories, protein, and fat. And so there, I think maybe around 3 things that are striking about this figure. So the first is just how the central role that cereals play. And so in Uni and Arna's paper, they showed that for Bihar and Karnataka. And so this is all of India. And so we can see that cereals across the entire country play an important role. So it's about more than 25% of the food expenditure per month. And then for any given day, more than 50% of your calories are coming from cereal. and the same thing for your protein. About, I guess, 60 or 70% of your calories are coming from cereals and protein. So the second thing that I think that's interesting about this figure is that there's kind of a lot of variation in kind of what you would call like the price per calorie or the price per protein of different types of food groups. So you can see here, for instance, processed food and beverage. So households spend maybe like about 1/8 of their food expenditure every month on this type of product, but then the amount of calories they get from this type of product is going to be very low. And then the last thing is just to kind of highlight the fact that the nutritional component of food in rural India is also very low. So this is 2004 to 2005, but since then there hasn't been a huge increase. And we can see here that the average per capita per day calories is only below 2,200. And I think in much of India, kind of the benchmark for kind of what is poor is 2,400 calories per day. And so on average, people kind of are well below that. And even in the later years of the data, it's still not above 2,400 per day. Okay, so I'm doing good on time. So this paper is a quantitative paper, so I tried to use statistical methods to try to relate the effect of a drought on a household outcome, like the consumption of calories. And what I do basically is I estimate 2 linear regressions. So the first is I'm going to use district level data. So for instance, I would relate production of rice. So I'd run a regression of rice production on a dry shock, which is what I mentioned earlier, which is the level of the amount of rainfall by which the amount of rainfall which is below the mean, so the absolute deviation from the mean in a given year. I'm going to have fixed effects. So I'm going to have a controlling for the average characteristic of a district in a given year, and also trends over time, as well as district characteristics. And then I'm going to do the same thing for household level data. And an important thing that I do in this type of analysis is I control for the calendar month. So that means I control for whether it's January, consumption is happening in January, February, March. So basically you can think to account for seasonal effects. So you can think of kind of the effect that I'm capturing as kind of the average effect across different types of months. And then I also include household characteristics, because as was mentioned earlier, some households are vegetarian by religion, some households are not. And so I'm accounting for that as well. So I try to, so by accounting for these characteristics, you can think of kind of the effect that I'm estimating as kind of the average across, so holding these characteristics constant. So basically comparing 2 types of households that are exactly the same in terms of whether they're vegetarian or not, and 2 types, and also exactly the same in terms of the month in which consumption was happening, and then one just gets a dry shock and then one doesn't. Okay, so the first graph that I'm going to show is just kind of the impact of the drought on agricultural production. So as I mentioned, there has been, a lot of papers that look at the impact of droughts on agricultural production and also just crop yields. And so here I'm just trying to kind of show that that is present, and also that my measure of a drought is valid. So we can see here, for instance, that when there's a dry shock of 1 meter, so basically when annual rainfall is 1 meter below the average, then rice yields fall by around 30%. And so that we can see that for wheat and rice, it's about 20 to 30%. And then for urad and potato, it's about 10%. But basically the point here is that, unsurprisingly, droughts are pretty bad for agricultural yields. So here's kind of the first kind of main result of the paper, which is to basically show the impact of the drought on household per capita food consumption and nutrition. So here on the x-axis, I have the different outcomes. So The first is just kind of total expenditure. So that includes non-food items. The second is food expenditure, so just expenditure on food items. The amount of calories that the household consumes, the amount of protein, the amount of fat. And so you can see here that across the board, on the y-axis, it's a percentage change. So basically, across the board, droughts are just really bad for households. So not just total consumption, total expenditure, so including non-food items, falls by around 5% when the dry shock is 1 meter, so it's 1 meter below the average rainfall. And then there's also around 7% decrease in expenditure on food. And that also translates into lower consumption of calories and fat and protein as well. So now I kind of, in the previous slide, showed you kind of the effect in aggregate across all different types of food items. So now to try to break that down by different types of food. So here I have the food groups that I discussed earlier, which is cereals, pulses, vegetables and fruits, animal source products, visible sugars and visible oils, and then processed foods. And the different bars are basically kind of the percentage change for each different type of outcome. So I think there's kind of a couple of things that are interesting in this picture. So the first is that if you look at just cereals, in comparison to all other food groups, the negative effect of the drought there is a lot smaller. So it's the smallest effect of, so basically what that means is that if cereals are already, cereals are a major component of food consumption on average, but that doesn't fall that much when there is a drought. So it still continues to be a major source of calories, protein, and fat, and also a major component of food spending during droughts. So in comparison, the largest effects of the drought is actually on things like processed foods, which tend to be kind of also the types of foods that are kind of more expensive per calorie or more expensive per gram of fat or protein. And so we can see here that basically kind of the relative, so basically when there's a drought, households kind of tend to, if they have $1 more, they would tend to buy, instead of buying processed food, they'd probably buy more protein, or sorry, more cereals, because it's just a cheaper source of nutrients. And it's also striking, I think, that you know, there's like this huge, relatively large decreases as well in consumption of pulses and vegetables and fruits, which if you read kind of a lot of nutritional guidelines, which I've done as part of this project, you know, pulses and vegetables and fruits are actually kind of highly recommended sources of diet, especially because they're kind of naturally nutrient-rich foods, and they're very high in kind of not just they're types of foods that are rich in a lot of vitamins and minerals as well. And so you can see here that they also move away from those types of items. And then what's also interesting, I think, is that when we think of like sugar and oil products, those are kind of products that kind of make food more palatable or kind of give it more of a richer taste. And households still kind of forgo those types of products during a drought. Okay. So as I mentioned, the second component of my project is to try to think about kind of the role that prices and income play during drought. And so here I kind of look at the effect of the drought on food prices. And so you can think of kind of these bars with whiskers as kind of like the how precise my estimates are of these effects. So you can see here that so the height of the bars represents kind of the effect I'm estimating, and then the whiskers of the line with the whiskers are kind of the precision, how precise these estimates are. And so in some ways, basically the effect of the drought on food prices are kind of very small. So the largest effect will be kind of like 3% change, 2% increase in price. But the line with the whiskers are kind of spanning both positive and negative effects. And so basically, it's really hard to kind of pin down. One thing that I think I'm taking away from this graph is that it's really hard. It's really hard to pin down the effects on prices, in part because of issues with quality, as Arne had mentioned in his earlier paper. But here, I'm not able to, because of that, I'm not able to say that there is a positive effect of drought on food prices. So it could be positive, it could be negative, but the magnitude suggests that those effects might be kind of small. So it's not more than kind of like 3% change. So the same thing with wages, but here the magnitudes that you find are actually a lot larger. So, so for instance, for someone who works in threshing, the effect of the drought on their daily wage will fall by around like kind of 8 or 9%. So this kind of suggests that wages and therefore income might play a more important role, and that actually also just echoes this kind of. There's been some literature as well in India which looks at the impacts of droughts on conflict. In those types of papers, they kind of highlight the role of income rather than prices as well. So I'm kind of echoing those results. So just since I only have 2 minutes left, just to wrap up. So as I said, food security is already pretty low, and so droughts just kind of like make it worse. And so it's kind of important to try to think about kind of policies that will help to mitigate those effects in the future. And so because the effect of the drought is not just to lower the amount of food that people are eating, but also kind of the nutritional composition of what they're eating, since they're just kind of relying more on cereals and decreasing their consumption of fruits and vegetables and pulses and animal sourced foods. Yeah, so I think that's kind of, I've said everything that's on this. So it's important to think about not just impacts on food, on the amount of food, but also the diet diversity and the nutritional value. That's it. Okay, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Fenella, for a very nice paper and contribution to the project. I think we can go straight into the final session. So can I ask all the speakers to be seated here? Yes. So Fenella worked only a year for NUPI, but it was very good value for money. Thanks for contributing to the project in a very nice way. So while you are preparing your questions, I could ask one specific question about the public distribution system. How could it interfere in some way on the cereals and the price, on the effects you measure?
So the data has purchases of cereals, not just from the public distribution system. It's both PDS and non-PDS in the data, so I'm lumping those together so far. But I think one implication of the PDS system is that basically most people kind of use that, as Uni has mentioned, as a source of kind of their grains. And so I think an implication of my paper is to kind of highlight that, you know, providing not just cereals, but also kind of fruits and vegetables. This focus on grain kind of is important to achieve food, to make sure that people have enough calories, but also kind of focusing on kind of consumption of more nutrient-rich foods would also be important as kind of a public policy rule.
So just a brief comment is also that that Fenella's paper contributes nicely on the climate component of the project, where we also had the International Food Policy Research Institute in Delhi as a major partner. So there is a paper, main contribution from IFPRI to the total project output. So, and I think you could also replicate this for Norway after the summer. Yeah. So maybe that's that could be next. Okay, we have a question there.
Lower consumption of food was more a question of having lower wages than that the prices went up.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make as well, although the data on both wages and prices are not very good, but that income seems to play a more important role in terms of its impact on the lower food lower total consumption of food, because basically kind of the impact on prices are kind of basically close to zero if you look at the magnitudes, and that's kind of consistent as well with some literature that there are people who have argued that weather-related issues kind of don't really have a strong impact on prices in India because of kind of some infrastructure on kind of the railroads and the transportation, like the national highway system that was built, and then also there's also storage. And so that kind of helps to make the impact of weather on prices to be kind of not as large as the effect on wages.
Okay, Uni, please.
Can I also add one result from our study, and that was that so few of our informants relied on own production. So this direct effect of climate change, of a drought or a flood, is limited because nearly all of them relied on market purchase or the public distribution system.
Yeah, I really like your presentation, especially this question of this impact on price and wage. But this data contains both rural and urban. Consumer expenditure survey.
Yeah, I used only the rural. I used only the rural subsample.
Therefore, then maybe the arguments he gave may be valid, that they are using their self-produced food. But if you take urban, then you may see some impact of price.
Right.
Second thing, can I say?
Absolutely, yes.
The question that Arne asked for this audience, I would like to say, the India's public distribution system really spoiled our eating habits. For example, in our state Karnataka, there is a very nutritious food which is called ragi, and that was not given through public distribution system to begin with. And we were somehow we were promoting rice, which is not so nutritious, but rice and wheat, because Punjab produce rice, wheat, so we have rice and wheat. So everybody started eating wheat, people started thinking wheat is the greatest food. The local food were not developed through the public distribution system. It completely spoiled our eating habits and made a scarcity of rice. That is one thing. But I am also a little bit surprised, if I have understood correctly, that during a drought, when I would think that the farmer will not get anything to eat, consumption decreased by about 10%. Am I right? So I thought it would decline much more than that. But also I see that the food intake of cereals and then the animal food, in terms of calorie, of course, cereal is higher, but in terms of expenditure, animal feed is also quite high. In your pie chart diagram, I could see that cereal expenditure on cereal is the highest, I think. But the animal meat, milk products is also quite high in your pie chart.
I think one question is to, like you said, is a 10% decrease in food consumption high or low? I mean, one thing that I am not able to kind of say anything about directly is kind of like the role of savings and kind of buffer stock and kind of making sure that people still have some consumption. But there could be kind of some role for that as well, although I don't have, the consumer and expenditure data don't have information on kind of like savings. So it's hard to see kind of whether, one reason why it's not as low as you might think is because people might have kind of like some role of savings or kind of access to financial markets. Yeah, no, but for proteins, yeah, actually, it was also surprising to me that, you know, it's not actually as small as we would think.
Yeah.
But I cross-checked my numbers with the numbers that's produced by the NSS, and it's kind of roughly in line. So, but
rather than explaining it as a kind of something which is to be expected, because it is a developing country, poor people's nutritional intake is small, and drought makes it even smaller, which is as expected. If you can argue that it makes it smaller but not so small, that kind of line of argument, I don't know, I thought maybe more interesting. You can think about it.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's kind of the NSS consumer expenditure data is just consumption.
Savings, I don't expect it to be high, because farmers' income and the cost of cultivation data are available, through which people have shown that farmers have negative savings. So through savings they will survive is very difficult. Maybe public distribution system giving some help, because there are some change in government policy where they have made rice at just 1 rupee,
right,
and
exactly,
things like that.
Yeah.
So because of this change in government policy, whether you can put some dummy variable in your regression, I don't know, just thinking aloud.
Yeah, no, those are, I'll look into it. I think those kinds of policies are kind of more recent, so I think they might not be covered in the data, but I'll look into it as well. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one question over there.
Thank you. My name is Eivind Hoffman. I'm as a semi-retired economist and statistician. I was very grateful for these statistics-dense presentations, and I have 2 questions. One is, you defined a shock in droughts with reference to the average rainfall over a 30-year period, but presumably rainfall is a skewed distribution. So I wonder if not median would have been more appropriate as an indicator of what is the level of rain that farmers and others and the food distribution system would adjust to and think of as the normal one. And my other question concerns the system that the Indian government and the state governments use for distributing subsidized food. My understanding is that increasingly the new identity system Aadhaar is being used as the criterion for being qualified to qualify for food, and that in some parts of India this new system has been used to exclude some vulnerable groups from receiving that. Is this a impression that is correct, or what do you see as this having as an impact on the particularly vulnerable groups of the Indian population?
Okay, this is a question for more speakers. You can, who wants to
Yeah, well, we did quite a few key informant interviews, which are not very recent, so I can't, it's a couple of years back, and they all were speaking about that. In Bihar, we found computers only in government offices. So in terms of digitalization, that was the sort of the limitation of that. So in terms of recording poor people in slums, but they were all very optimistic about it. They were talking a lot about it. So, and then they were also talking about the challenge, one of the challenges being electricity, because there are electricity breaks, and in many villages there isn't electricity everywhere. In Karnataka, this was much better developed, as might be expected, but still, this as you're saying, this exclusion issue is perhaps not technical at all, it's social. So yes, it's I think you're probably right. It's sort of a mixed problem, but as we know, digitalization can be much more efficient. So it's sort of, because these census data, they were usually old, and people holding a card, that situation might change, and that did not have any effects on the card holders, whether they got poorer or richer or whatever. Then that didn't affect their rights. So, but it is, with all these millions and millions needing something, you need a robust system. So I would say that any system that would be implemented would have problems. So,
Anela, you have some response on the median?
Yeah, no, it's an important point that kind of how you define what is a drought is an important question. So in the full version of the paper, I've done a lot of robustness checks where I looked at not just the absolute deviation, but also potentially the median and also percentage changes, right? Because those are kind of very different objects, but in the end, the negative effect is still there. So I think what I take away from that is that the effect of the droughts on food consumption is just kind of a negative robust effect. So, but it's a very important issue, and I think in much of the literature actually that relates conflict, for instance, with droughts. In those types of studies, I think the functional form basically of how you define drought is a lot more sensitive.
And let us now also take the opportunity to hear about some excellent student work undertaken in the project. So. So I'll leave the floor to in the project. We had two Arne, so we used the Mr. D and Mr. M. So Lisa. Yes.
Yeah, we were not able to present all the publications, but we had a master student from Center for Miljøutvikling. I don't know the English word for it, but I guess that most of you would understand what I mean. And she participated in the project using our household data from the slums in Bangalore to address particularly the most vulnerable group, which are the migrants. And she also had a field work. She was living in Bangalore at ISAC, at your institute, and conducting 6-month field work among the migrants. And she made a very good master degree that was awarded the best master degree for sustainability in Oslo for 2018. So she's going to present the result from her master degree at the annual dinner and the meeting of the university in 2 weeks. Very happy to say that. Impact, very important.
Okay, so I think we are. You have more questions at this stage. Any final comments from the speakers or panel? Yes.
I just wanted to add one thing about the vulnerability and about how to handle the climate change. And I think very much literature from, at least from anthropology and sociology as well, they are addressing the informal economy. I mean, the role of sharing gifts, norms of reciprocity for handling both immediate but also a long-term crisis. I think our findings were a little bit surprising there. It was, it emphasized the role of the income and purchasing power, because the impact of sharing and gifts were very minuscule. So I think this was quite surprising. They were doing some sharing in an immediate crisis in very limited short of time, but it really illustrates their involvement in the monetary economy and also prices as a very important issue in food security.
So let me just say towards the end that the question now is, I mean, how important is the food security of India for us here in Norway? Oh, the microphone, yeah. So So food security in India, how important is it to Norway and the West? Is poverty declining in fashion in a sense, because you have these political waves of interest? So, but I think it's very urgent to kind of keep a focus, because although I think now India has got competition from Indonesia, not from Nigeria, I mean, in terms of the number of poor. So, some of the most massive poverty worldwide is in India, and India is a major country in the world economy. So the transition of India is a kind of very essential part of global development. So I think it's kind of important that we keep track of it also from European and Norwegian perspective. So it's important for in the context of poverty elimination and global development, and it's also important in commercial terms because India is and becoming an even more important actor as an exporter and importer and part of the world economy. So that's why we thought it was very interesting to work on these issues. So I'm very glad that you all could contribute and present the various pieces of work. There are papers available on websites. The speakers have spoken about them. More is even to come in terms of publications. And I also thank you all for joining us at the seminar. And I thank the information staff for their great help arranging and preparing the seminar, Anna and Maria and especially. So any final comments before we close?
Final comment, and that is that our starting points at NUPI and CIFO, us doing consumption-oriented research from mostly sociological, and the economic trade-oriented Arne. And we have developed through this. As you can see, these papers are connected. And it's sort of it adds to the insight about the complicated patterns of how food security and insecurity, the dynamics of that. So thank you for this collaboration.
I thank CIFO too and the other partners, and it's as you said, an excellent example of interdisciplinary cooperation. So, Meenakshi?
Yeah. I also thank Arne for this opportunity. As we can see that there is a lot of interest in India, and I hope that we will work in future, because there are a lot of now new programs are coming up with the government. For example, in case of climate change, there is the crop insurance, which is a new crop insurance policy is taken by the government and pushing very hard. And similarly, GST, which is also interstate trade, may have impact. So we have new areas to work on, and we hope we'll continue to work. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much all for coming.